The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was a defining moment in United States history. It pitted the northern states, known as the Union, against the southern states, which had seceded to form the Confederacy. The primary cause of the conflict was the deeply entrenched institution of slavery, and the war ultimately led to the emancipation of millions of enslaved African Americans. This article delves into the causes, key events, and outcomes of the Civil War, with a particular focus on the emancipation process and its aftermath. The North and South had developed vastly different economies by the mid-19th century. The North was industrialized, with a diverse economy based on manufacturing, commerce, and agriculture. In contrast, the South relied heavily on an agrarian economy, with large plantations growing cash crops like cotton and tobacco, which were dependent on slave labor. The debate over states' rights versus federal authority also fueled tensions. Southern states championed states' rights, arguing that states had the authority to govern themselves and make decisions, including the right to maintain the institution of slavery. The North, however, increasingly supported a stronger central government that could regulate issues like slavery. The abolitionist movement gained momentum in the North, with activists like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe raising awareness about the brutal realities of slavery. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin and speeches by abolitionists stirred public opinion against slavery, creating a moral imperative for many Northerners to oppose its expansion. The Missouri Compromise was an early attempt to balance the interests of free and slave states. It allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state while Maine entered as a free state, maintaining the balance in the Senate. It also prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude. The Compromise of 1850 included several laws aimed at resolving the status of territories acquired during the Mexican-American War. It admitted California as a free state, enacted a stricter fugitive slave law, and allowed territories of New Mexico and Utah to decide on slavery through popular sovereignty. This act repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide on slavery through popular sovereignty. It led to violent conflicts known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed. In this landmark Supreme Court case, Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in free territories. The court ruled that African Americans were not citizens and had no right to sue in federal court, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, further polarizing the nation. Abraham Lincoln's election as president in 1860 was the final catalyst for secession. Lincoln, representing the Republican Party, opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories. His election convinced many Southern states that their way of life and economic interests were under threat. Following Lincoln's election, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union in December 1860. By February 1861, 6 more states had seceded, forming the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Eventually, 11 states would join the Confederacy. The Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fort's surrender after 34 hours of bombardment rallied the North to the cause of preserving the Union. The war began with a series of battles that demonstrated the resolve and ferocity of both sides. The First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, in July 1861 was a Confederate victory and dispelled any hopes of a short conflict. Both sides then settled into a protracted and bloody war. One of the most significant acts of Lincoln's presidency was the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. It declared all slaves in Confederate-held territory free. While it did not immediately free all enslaved people, it fundamentally transformed the character of the war, adding moral force to the Union cause and preventing European powers from recognizing the Confederacy. Key battles such as Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg were turning points in the war. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 1863, was particularly crucial, as it marked the last major Confederate attempt to invade the North. The Union victory at Vicksburg, July 1863, gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy. Enslaved African Americans played a critical role in their own emancipation. As Union armies advanced into Confederate territory, thousands of enslaved people fled to Union lines, seeking freedom and undermining the Southern war effort. These self-emancipated individuals, known as contrabands, provided valuable labor and intelligence to the Union forces. The issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation also allowed for the recruitment of African American soldiers into the Union Army. By the end of the war, approximately 180,000 black men had served in the Union forces, making significant contributions to the war effort and advancing the cause of freedom. The Civil War drew to a close in the spring of 1865. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate Army to General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. This marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy, although sporadic fighting continued for several weeks. The passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in December 1865 formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. It marked the legal end of slavery, but did not immediately grant full civil rights to African Americans. The post-war Reconstruction era was a turbulent and contentious period. The nation grappled with integrating formerly enslaved people into American society. Efforts to rebuild the South and extend civil rights to African Americans faced fierce resistance, leading to the eventual rise of Jim Crow laws and systemic racial discrimination. The Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved people were transformative events in American history. They preserved the Union and ended the institution of slavery, but the struggle for racial equality and civil rights continued long after the war's end. The legacy of the Civil War includes the ongoing fight against racism and the quest for a more just and inclusive society. The Civil War left an indelible mark on American culture and memory. Monuments, literature, and educational curricula continue to reflect on the conflict and its implications. The war also laid the foundation for future civil rights movements, as African Americans and their allies continued to push for equality and justice. Efforts to commemorate the Civil War and honor those who fought and suffered have taken various forms, from national parks and museums to annual reenactments and memorial services. These commemorations serve as reminders of the sacrifices made and the ongoing need for reconciliation and understanding.